if you can explain the difference, how democracy can be good and politics can be bad, but they're both the same thing, then you have no need of my products. You must know something I don't. Because I feel like I know the explanation, and it's a pretty darn complicated explanation.
I see, especially your recent writings, as it's almost as if you're trying to debunk ideas on the left and the right.
I think one of the, so basically the goal of this series, which I'm currently plug writing at the Claremont Institute's American Mind blog, that's kind of the, American Mind is, if you don't mind me saying so, kind of the second tier publication of the Claremont Institute. If it was really prestigious, I'd be in the Claremont Review of Books. Maybe I aspire to that, but or maybe I don't. But you know, the American Mind, the editors of that have done a really great job of kind of reaching out to kind of interesting new thinkers. Certainly, you know, probably people more interesting than myself. And and so the goal of this series is basically, you know, I would say if I made, you know, I wrote like a few 100,000 words in that damn blog, so I made a lot of mistakes, but I think if I made any kind of strategic mistakes in kind of how to think about this problem, it was the idea that sort of the cure for the present way of thinking and the way you should be thinking instead were one thing. And I don't think they're one thing, and they can't really be understood as one thing. The thing is that whether you're, you know, a progressive or a Nazi or a constitutional conservative or something else, I suppose there must be something else, I can't think of it, maybe a centrist pragmatist, you basically are kind of attached to a particular way of seeing the current world that I would say contains certain contradictions. And, you know, the way that you want to always carry out in kind of an intervention, whether it's a personal intervention or a political intervention, is to say, let's think about these contradictions and what you think. It's like my example of like democracy versus politics. I'm like, I'm just asking you a question. I'm like, if you can explain the difference, how democracy can be good and politics can be bad, but they're both the same thing, then you have no need of my products. You must know something I don't. Because I feel like I know the explanation, and it's a pretty darn complicated explanation. But sort of before you make that explanation, basically, you know, you have these kinds of attachments to these causes, these issues, even these individuals, these parties, these cultural groups, which are very, very emotional. You know, it's like being a Lakers fan or something. Probably some Lakers fans in the room. Let's have a moment for Kobe. All right. And yet you know that there's sort of nothing rational about being a Lakers fan, that it's actually kind of stimulating this sort of political instinct, this thymos, this desire to be relevant and powerful, which ends up in like team spirit and like, you know, just cheering mindlessly in front of the TV. Again, the pornography analogy suggests itself. So in a way, I'm basically like, you know, to kind of take that analogy a little bit further, I'm like, all right, young men, let's face it, you want to get laid. The first thing you have to do, like the way you're thinking of getting laid is basically, how do I meet the girls on the porn site? That is basically the way you currently think about politics. Okay, so basically the way...
Is this people on the left or the right or both?
Really both. And in order for you to basically have like this kind of normal romantic life like a normal person, you know, the first step is to just give up your porn. So I'm basically going to go through all these different kinds of porn, and I'm going to explain why it's not realistic. And so that's kind of the purpose of the series in a way, to basically say, okay, you know, as a progressive, you know, this is part 2. I'm not under the illusion that many progressives will read it, but there are a lot of them, so some will. And I'm like, here is kind of what's going on in your head when this stuff excites you. And maybe it's like, if you think a little harder, this is not the thing that you should be into. And then basically the same, and it's a very different story for why constitutional conservatism is hopeless and should give up. And then another one for why white nationalists, Nazis, whatever you want to call them, are hopeless and should give up. And so, you know, when you basically said, hey, you know, all of these things are hopeless, I'm like, imagine, you know, all of these things are hopeless, everyone is trying to change things and nothing is changing. You know, that kind of fits together in a way. And so to detach people from these kind of false, you know, very false kinds of systems, first of all, it's a service, you know, in itself. You know, the way I think about, you know, how should you think about politics or power? Let's say that, okay, you're probably an American. Let's say you move to Costa Rica. You become an expat in Costa Rica. What is your attitude toward Costa Rican elections and the Costa Rican government? Do you consider that this government has no right to rule over you because you did not consent to it? Do you not obey the speed limit? No. You obey the Costa Rican law because you live in Costa Rica. Do you vote in Costa Rican elections? Do you want to vote in Costa Rican elections? Do you like notice it in anything more than a practical way? No, then you're sort of completely detached. And that level of kind of detachment from the desire to change the world is very, very difficult. But paradoxically, I believe it's what's necessary if you're actually going to change the world.
Yeah.
It's seriously fucked up.
No, that's something that you and I definitely agree on. I come from a more kind of left-wing trajectory and you from a more right-wing trajectory. But I think, is it fair to say that you and I probably agree on something like the proposition that true intellectuals, whether they be artists or writers or philosophers or scientists, if what you're really looking for is true disinterested truth-seeking, one must A, detach from power and any dreams or hopes of having power or political efficacy, and B, it's probably going to be in some weird nether region beyond left and right.
Yeah, I mean, again, you know, you use these words left and right. These are, you know, very complicated words.
But that's my point, right?
Yeah,
that they're not
exactly.
really good. Yeah.
That you know, I would say that, you know, sort of a more immediate problem when I would say what people normally mean when they say left and right is simply competing cultural groups that are essentially competing, you know, kind of ethnic religions almost in a way. And, you know, one of my strongest beliefs is that if this country ever, you know, functions again or has a government that functions again, or at least maybe can like test people for the coronavirus, I think they're getting around to that. Like, you know, the difference in capacity between this country and China in that is remarkable. I mean, frankly, next week I wouldn't be here, and y'all would be wearing masks. But I wouldn't be here. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm, you know, but I think that's the case, and it's very possible that you're going to see the level of state capacity that we have in this country, you know, compared very directly. And if you're ever at a point where basically this country actually works and functions as a country, I think it's going to involve, like, I think one of the most striking things about right versus left is I think one of the main reasons that people support either side is fear of the other. The main reason that people are like feel passionate about being leftists is they have this sense that they're defending this like little dot of light of like civilization against this like horde of ignorant peasants. And, you know, anyone who has grown up in that, you know, that's with that feeling, you know, like knows that sense that, you know, we are the enlightened few and the masses out there are coming with burning pitchforks to like spear us. And this is not I mean, this is in the modern world a ridiculous fear, but historically this is not a ridiculous fear. And so you have this sense of like this kind of very deep and bitter loathing between the upper class and the middle class. Most people call, when they say mean middle class, they say lower middle class. And when they say mean upper class, they say middle class. You know, but basically between the professional managerial classes and anti-woke leftists would put it, you know, the, what would you call the Trump voters? The proles? Would you say proles? Don't say the plurables.
That's a good question. I don't think you could say proles. Proles is much more general, left and right, not just Trump.
You know,
there are Bernie supporters that are proles.
No, there are Bernie supporters that are proles, but they're not cultural proles, or they wouldn't be Bernie supporters. This identification of class stratification with like your bank account is one of the kind of characteristic distortions of leftism. It's all about culture, and you know, like if you've ever been a grad student and like some fellow grad student because his like stipend is low is like I'm poor. And it's like, no, you're not poor, you're broke. And those are just very different things. And so, like, status is a much more important determination of class than salary or bank account. And it's definitely a status conflict between, essentially, well, if you'll allow me to use, Marxist terminology, you have the professional managerial class, the proles, and what Marx would call the lumpenproletariat. So there's a sort of alliance of the ruling class and the lumpenproletariat, which is basically
The Democratic Party.
You could call it that. I really hate using these like code words. Like they just become inflammatory. It's like, at least you said Democratic Party. If you'd said Democrat Party, that would have meant you were on Fox News, right? My stepfather is a longstanding Hill staffer on the Democratic side. If you want to get him to explode at dinner, just say Democrat Party, which obviously I would never do. But the thing is, my point is that basically, if anything is ever going to actually work in this country, it's basically can only be as an alliance of all three of these classes. You cannot imagine any successful government that is like a government of like one over the others. And so one of the, for me, kind of the big political historical question is, to just take a really grand scope, are we in the late Roman Republic or the late Roman Empire? So if we're in the late Roman Empire, we're absolutely completely fucked. And there are certainly many kind of parallels that you can draw between, for example, the intellectual class that Justin was part of and like the grammarian ruling class of the late Roman Empire. You might have seen this class kind of parodied in a certain Monty Python movie. Really like just completely worthless people, but very well educated. And just useless against the Huns or whatever. Or are we in the late Roman Republic? And that's a very optimistic, most people are like, oh my God, it's like the late Roman Republic. I'm like, that's actually the optimistic perspective. And so one of the things about the Roman Republic, if you know like the kind of kindergarten version of the Roman Republic, you know that the whole history of the Republic is this conflict between first it's the plebeians and patricians, then those categories kind of become obsolete, and it's the optimates versus the populares, right? And which is basically optimates versus populares is Bernie versus Trump. It's as simple as that. And you're like, okay, how does this work out? It's true that they have some civil wars. I don't believe that civil war is possible today, which is another very optimistic perspective, which I will defend. But I just don't believe in violent politics at all, which is very optimistic. But the outcome of this is even more optimistic, which is that it kind of magically ends up with Augustus, the first Roman Empire, previously Octavian. And Augustus is actually a success. And one of the features of the Roman Empire is that this whole conflict between red states and blue states, populares and optimates, whatever, this whole civil conflict, which had been part of the fabric of the Roman Republic for 400 years, something like that, not an expert here, disappears. It's gone. It's never heard of again. So, if you could imagine basically an America in which there's no like red state, blue state conflict, no like race war, like none of this garbage, like, okay, what would you trade for that? I think a lot of people would trade, I think a lot of people would be ready to make, pretty large sacrifices for that. So in a way,
So what happened exactly? How did that come about?
Augustus. Have you heard of the guy?
Yeah, heard of him, but of course I know everything you're talking about. But for our audience, please remind them of a few of the details.
Okay, well,
a quick rundown, if you will.
Maybe in Roman history, like Trump versus Bloomberg is like Marius versus Sulla. So essentially, what happens is one side wins the civil war, but the side that wins the civil war is not really, it's like Caesar, who's the one who actually wins, and Caesar and Augustus have much the same plans. Caesar just wasn't really careful about his personal but they were basically they both had the style of unifiers. And they were, and by the way, they didn't claim to have abolished the republic at all. They claimed to have restored and fixed the republic. You know, they were just the first citizen of the republic, and it, you know, everything was voted on by the Senate. Of course, the Senate was a rubber stamp. You know, but you know, they never restored the title of Rex, the title of king, which was an old Roman, you know, title. You know, the last kings of Rome were driven out in like 500 something BC. Right, so they're like, we have saved the republic, but we've created in practice is effectively a monarchy. So in some ways, Augustus is actually more like FDR than you might think. And so, you know, let's imagine like, you know, Bloomberg doing a New Deal, and you know, like it's a ridiculous, yeah, it could never happen. But you know, the thing is that, you know, Augustus's Rome, like FDR's Washington, was a startup nation because it was under the absolute control of this guy Augustus, who was absolutely competent and completely effective and had no interest in continuing any of these squabbles. So there's this great story. It's about Caesar rather than Augustus. And I think it sort of expresses the kind of attitude that's kind of necessary in creating kind of anything new and awesome. Of course, you know, nothing happens without not violence but force. So, you know, Caesar's force comes from the popularis. He is originally a man of the popularis. So, you know, he fights the civil war, and he's fighting against Cato. And Cato is like, everyone super respects Cato. Cato is like, imagine like some like really old line, you know, Democrat who like really believes in the process, and really believes in the republic. It's not cynical at all. You know, this is a person who is just completely believes in the system. That's Cato. And so, you know, Cato gets beat. You know, he does this very Roman thing. He commits seppuku, actually. He does this like Japanese suicide ritual, and actually cuts his belly with his sword and like tears his own intestines out. And his slaves tries to push them back in, and he tears them back out again. Super gory, and would make a great movie. So Cato is beaten, right? But Caesar basically captures Cato's headquarters. And in Cato's tent, there's a big chest. And the chest is full of letters from his supporters in Rome. So one of the things that about these conflicts in Roman history, and you see this extensively in kind of the preludes to that final civil war between like Marius and Sulla, is something called proscription. And that idea of proscription is when you win one of these contests, you basically are like, okay, who are the wealthy supporters of the other side? We are going to kill them and take their property and give it to our friends.
I think Sanders supporters are getting excited listening to you say
Yeah,
that.
right. So, you know, imagine if, like, Trump wins the election, he throws Soros in jail, he takes all of Soros's money and redistributes it to, like, magatards, right? If you'll excuse my French. You know, so this would be a very aggressive action by Donald Trump, but that was absolutely normal in Roman politics. So basically, completely normal, expected thing to do. So, you know, Caesar's guys basically find this chest, and they're like, holy shit, you won't believe what we found. Because we're like, this is the mother lode. Because, of course, a lot of these motherfuckers would write letters to both sides. They'd be like, Cato, man, you're the one. You're really strong. You know, you have these Roman values. And then they'd be like, Caesar, oh, my God, you're so Caesar. Right, you know, and so they'd write the same letter to both sides. So, you know, these are the people that you really want to find because these are not your guys, right? That you can't trust them. And you really want to kill them and take their property. And then there are the guys who are just against you. And you definitely want to kill them and take their property. So, you know, Caesar's guys are super hot to trot, right? And they're like, what do we do? How do we start working through this? Caesar's like, okay, take the chest of letters, put it on a bunch of logs, pour olive oil on it, and set it on fire. These guys are like, what? Caesar's like, you don't get it. Like, motherfuckers, we won. We won. They're all our guys now. And so, you know, that sense of basically they're all our guys now, you know, is basically essential to anything that actually works. And so, you know, that's obviously, you know, very far from this vision of, you know, peasants with red hot pitchforks, you know, visiting, you know, the University of Southampton, I guess, to, you know, basically toss you on their devilish burning tines. It's the absolute opposite, but it also doesn't mean, we must, hound and harry the peasants and, basically go full Spartan on them. Which is really, I think, in many ways the attitude of not necessarily there's definitely, I don't know, when I say go full Spartan, one of the things the Spartan elite like to do is basically, if you were like a young Spartan, like, ruling class, like Chapo Dude or whatever, you would basically imagine if like Chapo Dudes like had like secret Chapo parties where they went in and like just found, like, drove out to the suburbs and found like some like MAGA dude with like a MAGA sign in front of his hat and just like burned his house down and killed him. That would be like the Spartan way of being a ruling class, right? And I think there's people that like to do that, and I'm very confident of it. And so that, like, that mentality is a very dark and evil mentality, which in a way very much parallels the mentality of the average school shooter today. And I can say average school shooter because, frankly, there's a lot of them. And so you kind of see this kind of, like these pathological phenomena emerging out of this conflict. And I think it's a very pathological conflict. And I'm certainly, these are very, banal sentiments. Everybody's going to agree with that. Nobody's going to agree with basically how you get out of it. But
right.